This is the story of Great Britain's secret war in Antarctica, of how British Special Forces encountered the Polar Men. In 1938, the German army sent an expedition to Antarctica with a mission to investigate sites for a possible base and to make formal claims in the name of their country. To prepare them for their mission, they invited the great polar explorer Richard E. Byrd to lecture them on what to expect. The following year, a month after hostilities had commenced in Europe for World War II, the Germans returned to New Schwabenland to finish what they had started. What many suggested was that they were constructing a base. And at the time, many suggested that what they were constructing was a base. Before I get too ahead of myself, y'all know the drill. And as you all already know, 9 years after lecturing the Germans on what they may encounter in Antarctica, Admiral Richard Byrd would take his own fleet to Antarctica on Operation Highjump. And many assumed that this mission was to eradicate the rest of the secret German bases from Queen Maudland, which the Germans renamed New Schwabenland. And of course, they encountered much more than that. But that's not this story. This story is about Great Britain and their presence in Antarctica during World War II. You might say they were the unsung hero in Antarctica during the war, as they were largely responsible for thwarting the Germans' effort in taking over the continent entirely. But unfortunately, their efforts would mostly go unnoticed, as Operation Highjump and Admiral Byrd's epic encounter would end up stealing the show. Crafts that could fly pole to pole in mere seconds, meetings with beings from inner Earth, his tale would cement itself in the history books as one of the most captivating moments surrounding the war. But that's not to say the British didn't have some strange encounters of their own. In fact, the group of special forces covered in this account may have had an adventure that rivals even Admiral Byrd's himself. So sit back, relax, and I'm telling you folks, you don't want to miss this one. The story begins, ironically, at the end of World War II. The war ended with the Allies victorious, but unfortunately for Great Britain, it had gone bankrupt and been humiliated by the two established superpowers in the process. See, before World War II had started, it was believed that Great Britain had become one of the most powerful superpowers in the world, in the fact that they owned literally a quarter of the world at the time. It was believed that their Royal Navy was by far the strongest navy on Earth. At the time, little was known what force the US could be, and Russia was thought to be an easy target for Germany. But at the end of the war, it was the United States atomic bombs and Russia's tanks rolling through Berlin that established who the two superpowers were. And though things hadn't turned out in Great Britain's favor during the war, they saw a chance to redeem themselves. What many didn't realize is during the war, Great Britain had gathered a lot of intelligence, much more than any other power fighting for the Allied force. And this was because of the size of the Royal Navy. It was massive. And relative to that, the other reason was because of the size of Germany's U-boat fleet. When they would capture the German U-boats, they would interrogate the captains and get information. Some of the information gathered led them to believe that the Germans may just have a base in Antarctica. To put it in perspective, the Germans surrendered in Europe on May 2nd, 1945. Going into March of 1945, they had built 463 U-boats, and they were active. Well, the U-boat crews were known to be stubborn, so many of them didn't surrender, even though Germany had. Throughout 1945, they figured that as many as 100 U-boats were still on the loose. Some evidence of this, though you will not find it if you search it or in the history books, was an article posted by the El Mercurio newspaper of Chile on May 2nd, 1945. They claimed it was the final naval battle of World War II between the Kriegsmarine and the Royal Navy. The Kriegsmarine came out on top, and only one Royal Navy destroyer survived, with the captain claiming, "May God help me. May I never encounter such a force again." The question is, where did that force end up? And that's where Great Britain had an idea. And that was intelligence soon substantiated with the capture of 2 U-boats and the interrogations of their captains. One of those captains was Captain Wilhelm Bernard. He divulged information on Operation Valkyrie 2, where it said he set off on April 13th, 1945 with his U-boat to Antarctica. Supposedly 16 crew members had landed in Antarctica and had buried a bunch of important documents pertaining to Germany's role in the war. The other was Captain Heinz Schäfer in the notorious U-boat U-977. He claimed that he was also ordered to go to Antarctica. There's been lots of mystery surrounding this particular U-boat, and this was due to unsubstantiated claims that possibly the Holy Grail was on board or the Spear of Destiny, but these actually cloud the truth of the situation. For one, General George S. Patton was able to get a hold of the Spear of Destiny, but you didn't hear that from me. Another incident was the capture of a U-boat in 1944 that had tons of mercury on board. Now, why mercury, you say? Well, mercury was used as a fuel source, apparently, for some of these U-boats. So the reason they had it on board was because they were traveling long distances to where? Antarctica. So based on this intelligence, Great Britain knew what they had to do. They had to send special forces to establish a base in Antarctica and snuff out the rest of the German strongholds still in operation. War ended in Europe. Felix and his crew were in caves in what was now former Yugoslavia. He was glad the war was over, but had a feeling it wasn't over for him. And this was only verified when his captain told him that he may have to go to Palestine. Even though the war was over in Europe, Pacific tensions were still rising. He was lucky he didn't have to go and fight the war in Japan, he thought. But regardless, he ended up in Palestine. He and his crew were fighting against the Zionist terrorist organization. These terrorists were not only regularly attacking Palestinians, but they were also attacking British forces that were sent there to curb their uprisings. He would end up seeing many of his fellow soldiers lose their lives. That's when, much to his relief, he received an order to meet with his commanding officer because he was to go on a secret mission that even they didn't know about. He was requested to go to Gibraltar, and this is where he was hoping he would get discharged to his hometown. But how wrong he was. He'd spend another Christmas at war. Upon arriving in Gibraltar, he was told that he would be flown to the Falkland Islands. There he would be further briefed and meet up with other elite soldiers fighting for British forces. His curiosity only grew as all the soldiers that he met with were told that they were not even to speculate as to why they were there or what they were doing. They could not even talk to each other about it. Upon arrival, they met the officer that was in charge, along with a Norwegian resistance fighter who was an expert in winter warfare. Today, the Falkland Islands are the best kept secret of the British Army. If you're sent there, you're looking at an easy couple years. But back in the 40s, it was much different. For the next month, Felix and his comrades took part in some of the most grueling training he had ever seen. They were preparing for cold weather warfare and still hadn't been briefed on exactly what their mission was. From taking polar dips into a freezing Atlantic Ocean to living in tents in South Georgia. The training was intense and it made little sense to each of the soldiers until finally they were told why they were there. They met with a major and a scientist, and as they were being relayed the mission, they realized that many of them may not come back. They were told they were going to investigate anomalous activity at a base the Britons had in Maudheim. From there, they were to investigate a base that the Germans had established in Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains. The Britons had established a base in Maudheim. This was their largest, as it was only 200 miles from the German base. The men were told that this was Britain's secret war. There was a number of U-boats still missing and unaccounted for. They had captured 3 of Germany's most renowned U-boat captains, and they informed them of all the activity that was taking place in Antarctica. They weren't informed as what was expected of them from Great Britain, or what they would find. At this point, they could only speculate. And still as they trained, more information came forward. Slowly they were divulged more information as their training went on. They were told that the previous summer, scientists from the base had found an ancient hidden tunnel. Under orders, the British forces were told to enter the tunnel. Only 2 of them would make it out alive. During the following winter months, the 2 survivors rambled on over the radio about polar men, ancient tunnels, and German bases. Radio contact was finally lost in July of 1945 of the next year. In the last transmission, "Polar men, they have found us," and the radio cut off. This didn't set too kindly with Felix and his fellow soldiers, as they were about to go on a mission to the said base. These men's mission was to go to the base in Maudheim, investigate the ancient tunnel, and check into the enigma of the polar men, and also look into the claim of the German base and eradicate any Germans that may be there. That the Britons wanted to beat out US and USSR investigation into Antarctica. They wanted to find any alleged German bases and confiscate the technology. They wanted to eradicate the Germans first and claim the last battle that took place in World War II. That way they could come out on top of the war and use it as a propaganda. They approached the base weary, unsure of what was awaiting them. They only found that it seemed to be devoid of any life. Quickly those fears subsided as they knew they had a job to do, so they pressed on. They split up to search the entire base, but shortly after, a tripwire was detonated and a siren sounded. They immediately raised their guns towards the darkness of the base, and that's when they heard a voice. "Who's there? Who goes there?" There was only darkness, and that's when the major introduced their squad. After introduction, the voice produced a body. It was a lone survivor they had heard over the radio almost 2 summers ago. What he divulged to the men only had them more anxious and worried, and they wished they had had more troops to begin with. He also told them that in Bunker 1 was the other lone survivor. Also, there was a trapped polar man in the bunker with him. Despite the panicked objections of the survivor, the door was ordered to be opened by the major. The survivor literally had to be held back, and this only scared the crew that much more, and nobody wanted to be the one to go in there. The youngest of the crew was then volunteered. He proceeded forward and hesitated with the door, barely being able to get it open. As he walked inside, a silence fell over the base. Then, out of nowhere, 2 gunshots followed. The door flew open, and the men were not expecting what they were about to see. By the time the men got their bearing, the beast was running away from them in a split second at incredible speeds. They took a few shots at it, but none of them even came close to hitting their mark. Shaken to the core with fear, they all decided to enter the bunker, and the soldier who drew the short straw was laying on the floor, unalived. The other original lone survivor who had locked himself in there with the beast had also been found, but it looked as though the polar man had used him to survive. The only thing that remained was his skeletal structure. The men were angry and demanded answers. One of their unit had just been lost. So objectively, they directed that anger at the other lone survivor. The squad was all ears, and the major asked how that soldier became trapped inside with him. The lone survivor decided to start from the beginning. The scientist who was accompanying them began to scribble down every word. They found out that it all began near one of Antarctica's dry valleys, where they found the tunnel. Shortly after locating the tunnel, the 30 personnel at the Maudheim base were ordered to infiltrate and see what was in there. They would enter the tunnel and track for miles until they opened up into a vast underground cavern. The vast underground cavern was abnormally warm. The scientists with the crew figured it had to be warmed geothermally. They discovered that the cavern was riddled with underground lakes, and to add more to the mystery, it seemed to be artificially lit. The vast system proved to be so large that they had to split up team to cover it properly. They found that the Germans had constructed a huge base, and that they even had docks for the U-boats to come from underneath the water. If that isn't strange enough, a hangar filled with large, odd planes that seemed to fly without propellers or propulsion. However, as they were investigating the tunnels, the 2 lone survivors noticed the others had been caught, and they watched them, one by one, get taken out. They decided quickly that they should leave the tunnel, as their aim was to blow it up and block it off. Unfortunately, they were spotted by the polar men, and they were pursued out of the tunnel. I hope y'all enjoyed the beginning of that awesome story. I'm going to finish it here very soon. It'll be up tomorrow. It was just too long of a story to lump into one. Tomorrow, I'm going to post what the current squad of soldiers has to do, and then finish the story of what the 2 lone survivors endured. Sorry, it's been a while since I posted a long form video. It's been crazy. Tax season's here, so I've been super busy, but I'm going to get back on track here, starting with this video, y'all. All kinds of good content out there, all kinds of good stuff to tell you guys. So stay in the love, stay in the light, be kind to others. I am out.